This comes along all right now. This is July 31st. Marian Lindeman and I are still reminiscing. Today we want to talk about some of the things which we saw happening at Augsburg, which we think helped build the present-day liberal arts college from developing liberal arts concept up through the years. Dr. Russell Cooper came to the University of Minnesota and, as a representative of the North Central Association, organized some meetings of the Minnesota private colleges. Dr. Sverdrup invited Professor Hendrickson and me to go with him to attend the first such one at the College of St. Catherine's. At least this, I think, is the first one. Besides being served a most delicious dinner in 5-6 courses of the most delicious food and the most beautiful dishes that I'd ever eaten of them, we had an amazing sort of meeting. Sister Antonine was the president of College of St. Catherine's and a very brilliant and able woman. Dean Pike from the University of Minnesota had been on the staff or the Board of Regents or the advisors in creating and building up the College of St. Catherine's. I'm not sure whether he still was living at that time and was there, but anyway, this was a beginning of a series of meetings of the North Central Association talking about college teaching and how to teach better and how to reach people, testing programs and all this, and out of this grew the cooperative effort of all the colleges in the state of Minnesota to have a joint testing program and to develop a form of application to colleges, which all the colleges used. Augsburg College, being A in the alphabet, was always at the top of this list, but I know that we grew a great deal by the experience of joining with these other people. During the days of pushing for some accreditation, we had a number of students who wanted to go on to graduate school at the University of Minnesota after I came to Augsburg. And I know that we were seeking various kinds of accreditation with the State Department in Minnesota, and they said if you can be accredited by your different departments at the University of Minnesota, then I think this was a step in the direction of accreditation. And I recall very vividly the one day I came down from chapel, and here stood Dr. Cray from the History Department of the University of Minnesota and one other man who was starting to do some examination in the different departments. Dr. Cray had been my advisor when I did my undergraduate work in history, and he said, "Are you teaching history here?" And I said, "Yes." And Professor Hendrickson, "Well, if you and Hendrickson are teaching history here, I know the history department is okay." So we were accredited by the history department. Marian Lindeman tells me that some man from the French department came over to see her, and I know that a number of the different departments, so department by department, we were accredited by the University of Minnesota. This led to a kind of a state department accreditation. And I recall, too, that the graduate school, I think under Dean Ford, made a survey of the kind of work that Augsburg College graduates had been doing at the University of Minnesota and found a very creditable record. And so our students, graduates, were allowed to enter graduate school with in regular process after that. But I recall that when some of the students graduated and wanted to teach in states other than Minnesota, Dr. Sverdrup oftentimes took the train to the State Department in these different states and talked with them and really sold them on the idea and explained to them that a graduate of Augsburg College was really a graduate of an accredited institution that was accredited with the University of Minnesota and with the Minnesota Department of Education. I know he made one such trip to Montana, he made one such trip to Oregon, one such trip to the state of Washington. These were really costly and were very difficult. But he did them in order to help the students. So I think that out of an experience which grew out of the church together with our growing relationship with the University of Minnesota in this accreditation was a workshop that the American Lutheran Church made. there was an American Lutheran Conference formed by several of the church bodies joining together, the then ELC, the ALC, the Augustana Synod, and several others. They set up several commissions, and among the commissions that were established was one called the Commission on Higher Education. The executive secretary of that department was Dr. J.C.K. Preuss, who is still living, although retired from his work for some years ago. He was an able scholar and an able administrator. Among the people on his commission, I know Dr. George Sverdrup served at one time. Whether Dr. Bernard Christensen was concurrent with that or not, I don't know. But in the fall of 1935, Dr. Preuss had sent, and this commission had sent invitations to all the Lutheran colleges in the United States to meet at St. Olaf College the first weekend in October. Some 400 or 500 people came to that conference. Of course, there were several hundred faculty people at St. Olaf, but there were representatives from Pacific Lutheran University in the West Coast, Uppsala College, Wagner in the East Coast, and happily Dr. Kretzmann from Valparaiso of the Missouri Synod was there, and he was an ardent follower of this group all those particular years. And all the colleges of this Midwest area from the Appalachians to the Rockies. They talked a great deal about the philosophy of Christian higher education. And I think maybe they call Lutheran higher education. But like Ruth Sigelsson of our faculty said, why should say always Lutheran? Because some of these places aren't just Lutheran. Isn't it Christian rather than just Lutheran? This was one of the distinctions that we needed to take a look at and know. Now, just prior to this, Arthur Nash at Augsburg had a year's sabbatical in order to travel to New Zealand and Australia on a workshop with a woman from the University of Minnesota who was heading up this research. And I had a year's leave of absence to go out and teach in China. During these times and these experiences where we visited other countries and visited other colleges and universities, again, I think the two of us got a great deal of outlook, something which we needed sorely to sort of bolster up the idea of what kind of breadth we should have in some of our educational programming. Shortly after this, Dr. Sverdrup died, and Dr. Bernard Christensen succeeded as president. Professor H.N. Hendrickson served as acting president the year between. One of the things that Hendrickson asked me to do for him that year said so many people are wanting to go into social work, and social work is a coming field. So he asked me if I would make a study and bring a report to him of the requirements in the curriculum for courses which would be necessary to lead up to the graduate school in social work at the University of Minnesota. This I did. Among other things, I found there should be a survey course of the Introduction to Home Economics. Subsequently, we hired Mrs. Springer to be our dietitian, and she taught 2 classes of Introduction to Home Economics as general education in what had been the old laundry rooms at Mortensen Hall. But we will have another recording session and bring all these people together who worked with the home economics at Augsburg. This is just to note that it is coming. But we also found that it would be very important then, in the discussion with Dr. Christensen and Dr. Martin Kronbeck, who had been brought to Augsburg in the fall of 1938, I suppose it was in the fall of 38, that we would need to make a preliminary survey of what it would require to become a member of the North Central Association. We learned that Dr. Neal, N-E-A-L-E, at the University of Minnesota, professor of public school administration, was on an examining committee of the North Central Association, and he also made a practice of doing a private survey of colleges, following the pattern, so that we engaged the services of Dr. Neal to make a survey. This was at a time when they were discussing the pro and con of whether to move out to Augsburg Park or to stay on the particular campus where we were. Just completed in 1938-39 was the Sverdrup Memorial Hall, which Dr. Sverdrup had given his last measure of physical strength for. And with this one new building located there, it seemed hard to think in terms of moving out to Augsburg Park. Dr. Neal interviewed many people, pro and con, about accepting that invitation to go out to Augsburg Park and build there. But his strong recommendation at the end of these studies was that we stay and become a metropolitan college. There are many suburban colleges, but there are very few, and there is no Lutheran metropolitan college. He spoke very enthusiastically about Mundelein College in Chicago, adjacent to Loyola University, which Mundelein is a college for women. No, at that time he spoke about that as a beginning one, that was doing a very excellent kind of thing. Well, no, Capital University is located in Columbus, Ohio. That's Lutheran, yes, former ALC. But most of the colleges are located in rural towns or out in the country. Since then, of course, Carthage College has moved from a rural community in Illinois to the shores of Lake Michigan, north of Chicago, in one of those suburb towns. So it really is in a city. And of course, I think the Missouri Synod have a number of schools that are in cities. But at least at this time, we made this recommendation was very strong to stay where we were and to plan to build and to develop our college there. So following this report, this study made by him, which indicated a number of our great weak spots, especially in our business affairs and our business arrangements, then we moved on to develop, as a faculty, a 5-year program. This we should do each year for 5 years. And having completed that 5-year period, then we had corrected some of these glaring mistakes. At least we thought we were current, and made application to the North Central Association for accreditation. This meant a year-long study and reports and blanks. Now, these copies of these are all on file, I'm sure, in the dean's office or in the dean's records. And I remember very vividly that they came to examine us one day, and I'd been having a bout with the flu. And I'm afraid I probably was walking around with a walking pneumonia. Anyway, I went over to the Memorial Hall dining room to meet with these people, and we were going to talk, and I became violently ill and had to be taken home, and I think it sort of threw a little monkey wrench into the whole business of what we were trying to do. At least they recommended that we wait a few years before we, the application went in. And at that time, we didn't have a library, except the old library, which had been expanded in the ground floor of what is now called Old Main. And we were turned down in accreditation. They said, really, you have enough going for you so that we could give you accreditation, except that if we give you accreditation now, you will delay getting your library. And we just feel that a new library is an exceedingly essential part of this. Some of this you will find, I'm sure, in the references in the correspondence in regard to that that's on file. So the question was, what are we going to do? How are we going to get the money? Our church body had decided that we would have to have $100,000 pledged before the annual meeting, in order to be able to raise the money. Well, this was around 1951-52. And in the spring of the year of 1952, one of the senior boys who had been in service, Russell Berg, and his fiancée, Esther Larson, who was just finishing her sophomore year, said to me, the church conference is going to be in Seattle this summer. Why don't you come and go out west with us, ride out with us? Russell had bought a car. Dad and my sister and her family are coming for the meeting. Mother's staying home getting ready for the conference. Why don't you ride out with us? And one of the other boys is going to ride out too. So be four in our car, and Dad and my sister and her husband, two little boys in the other car. And I said, oh, wouldn't that be fun? And just walked away thinking that no students are going to ask the Dean of Women to ride out west with them. In the afternoon, those two young people came into my office, and Russell said, I'm dead serious, Miss Mortensen. We would like to have you ride out with us. Mother can't come, and Esther's mother can't go out. And we two boys don't want to ride alone just with Esther. We would really love to have you come. So the upshot of the matter was I did go. And you don't drive 2,000 miles with three young people who accepted you as an equal. And I discovered again the tremendous insight that they had into the running of the college and the deep concern and the deep interest. And I talked about many things, and of course they want to know just why didn't we get accreditation with North Central? Why were we turned down? And then Russell said, you know, Gerda, I wish you'd tell Dad some of these things. When we got out to Seattle, nothing doing, he wanted me to have his room at his home, so he and his boyfriend took some bunks down in the basement, and I was the extra guest in the home. I went to visit some of my relatives for a week after the annual conference was over, and then was coming back on the train, and we were having a picnic down on the beach. And Russell said, come on now, level with Dad, level with Dad. So I started to tell some of the inside problems that we had at the institution and the tremendous need that there was for this library, for the accreditation. And when I got through talking about all these things, Mr. Berg said, I'd like to have a chance to raise that $100,000 for you. I said, may I tell my president this when I come home? Yes, he said, you may. So I went immediately to the president's office, and a letter was dispatched that very day to him, inviting him to come and to do this. Well, he and Mrs. Bird came in the fall, and they were my house guests for about 2 months. And Gilberg traveled much of the time, and he got Sigvald Hjalmaland to come with him, and they traveled up into North Dakota, all around, to see and to do different things, meet different people, and on his own, at his own expense, giving all his time, his travel, he came to the annual conference that following June with $100,000 pledged. And so the way was clear to go ahead and to build this library, providing we could get the accreditation then. This introduced him to Augsburg, and he would always come for homecomings. And I remember one year he said, I owe my interest in Augsburg to Gerda Mortensen, the visit that she made to our home, and the sharing of the needs of this institution with us. He was subsequently elected to the Board of Regents and served for 10 years. During that time, he really started to have our college administration put on a really better business basis. He was a businessman from Seattle. He knew business. He went down to visit Valparaiso University, studied the way in which they promoted things. And we had the advice of a finance advisor for a number of years after that. But this was an incentive to get the money. And having gathered the money, we built the building. And then we wrote, again, to make an application for accreditation with North Central. And this time we had to have a year-long study, so it would take us a whole year. And at the end of the year, again, the examiners were to spend a day with us. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, I was to be gathered with the other administrative people in the president's conference room meeting with these people. 10 minutes of 9 that morning, a student from Mortensen Hall came dashing into my room, and she said, "We found so-and-so up in the attic with sheets ready to commit suicide. What shall we do?" Well, I dashed over to the room and immediately called our college physician, who in turn called a psychiatrist. And he said, "Keep an eye on that girl all day." I said, "I will have to have parental permission to hospitalize her. And they live in the country." So I got these 2 girls, roommates of this girl, to not go to classes, but keep watching her all morning. The college doctor was coming on campus, and the psychiatrist was alerted. So I came 15 minutes late to that meeting. And then I needed to put in a long distance after the hour was over. I said I was I just simply had to be excused because an emergency had arisen. But they accepted this. And then when the man was in having a conference with me about my work, I had put in a long-distance call to the father, but they lived on a rural telephone line, and I said, "Some emergency has happened. Would you please get to a private phone and call me back?" And I couldn't understand why a whole hour went by before he called back. He called back to say there has been such a snowstorm out here. I had to wait until the worst of the snowstorm was over so that I could get to town to telephone. When I explained the situation, he gave me permission to. Then this man, I said this emergency call is coming. You're welcome to sit here and listen to the conversation or to step out, whichever you wish. Well, he decided to step out. But I arranged then, and then telephoned immediately to the doctor and all, and said that I personally would bring her out to Glenwood Hills at 5 o'clock, when I would be through with some of these meetings. But that day, which was so crucial for us, here I was faced with these most awful situations. And then all at once a girl said, "She slipped out of our hands somewhere. We don't know where she is." Only she'd gone to get her mail or something, and then they had located her again. But by 5 o'clock, when I walked into the hospital with her and met the psychiatrist, and she was registered in, and I could finally, having given her over to the nurse, wend my way home, I thought I had never lived through that kind of a day. And what kind of impression would these people have of me and my work? Well, just look up the record of the report when we were accredited and see what they say about Gerda Mortensen.
Tell me right now.
There were 2 people, faculty people, that were singled out for distinctive comment when they accredited us. One was Ernie Anderson as the head of the physical education department and his standards as far as athletes and athletics is concerned. And the second person was Gerda Mortensen, who is doing at least to the credit, you see.
Marian is insisting that I tell her right now.
Well, Marian is insisting that I tell her. Well, it just said that she is just, they were just superlative things. And Dr. Christensen said to me afterwards, "You got us accredited with the North Central Association."
They realized what was going on and how marvelously you were taking this.
Yes, I think so. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I was terribly happy because I had really gotten Gilbert to get interested. But it was a student that prodded me, his own son that prodded me to do this. And these students' confidence in me and in my interest in the institution, and they're showing their interest. And then in turn getting Mr. Berg to come, I opened my home for them. They were there, and I caught some of these things, encouraged them. And oh yes, that fall he had his 50th birthday and discovered it was the same day that Dr. Bernard Christensen had 50th birthday. So they had open house over there. Now, everybody spoke very fondly of Dr. Christensen. They either used his initials, BMCs, they spoke about him, or Dr. Christensen. And when Gilbert came in, he slapped him on his shoulder and said, "Hi, Bernie, how are you?" So we were accredited with the North Central Association. This made a very wonderful feeling among the people on the faculty and the students at the college. A catalog could now carry the statement, fully accredited with the North Central Association. This was a very important aspect of student need that had been met. Faculty felt very happy about this and proceeded immediately to make a 5-year plan again for study of the growth and development of the college. Faculty study committees were set up. We had some faculty workshops every fall with sometimes an extra week of summer school workshop in addition to this, in order to try to take a look at the problems of the growing college and the needs for a current college that was meeting the needs of today. Dr. Christensen came as president of Augsburg College without the experience of being trained in administration. He immediately set forth, and his brilliant wife with him, to study and read everything possible that they could lay their hands on the problems of higher education in the United States, the progressive movements within higher education in the United States, and became friends with Ruth Eckert Paulson at the University of Minnesota, and other people attended national conventions, and I think intellectually equipped themselves, both Dr. Christensen and his wife, to know what some of the trends were and what some of the needs were. And in those early years, we had a feeling that they were really the intellectual leaders. They had a scope in their own education and scope in their intellectual thinking, which rubbed off onto other faculty people. And we felt that here we had real intellectual leaders as well as spiritual leaders. Dr. Nash was asked to be dean of the college for a year. He served a year, and then he said to me one day, "Gerda, I just can't be the dean of the college, because I don't feel that Dr. Christensen comes in and talks over problems with me. He talks them over with his wife at home and comes with these ideas. And this is it." And we all felt this way. When he came, he asked us all to sit down, and he scrapped everything we ever had in student personnel work, and he wanted us just simply to start from scratch all over again. It was very difficult. I know in some of those first years I resigned by letter 3 times. I said, I can't stand this. I have to have the scope to work and move and to do as I think is right to do and the insight that I have gained. And so gradually Dr. Christensen came to sense this and to realize it. And when we moved into the setup and decided to have student personnel work, he said, now I want you to be coordinator of student activities. So all the student life on the campus is under your direction. So I really was an associate dean of students, which title I didn't get until my retirement year. It was an honorary promotion. Dr. Anderson said it carried no financial increment. So honored is accepted too. But this was one of the things. But I think that the North Central Association workshop in problems of higher education at the University of Minnesota had 1 or 2 people at Augsburg College continuously from 1945 on through all the years. Some problem which needed further study at Augsburg was taken by some faculty person. And I remember when we were starting to talk about building a college center, college union, student union, that I asked Dean Quanvik one day, does anybody done anything in the background of philosophy of what is needed in all of this? Maybe this is a topic that should be selected. Maybe Mrs. Peterson could go, Levon, or Ernie Anderson or somebody. Turned around and said, well, I think maybe you better go. So I went for my 3rd workshop in problems of higher education and did the preliminary study for the philosophy and the basis on which you're going to develop a college center. These workshops then came back and with reports, and we tried to implement some of these things that we had learned. And also at this time, other teachers were encouraged to go to national conventions. There had been no budget for national conventions earlier, although Dr. Sverdrup allowed me to go to conventions, although there sometimes I had to pay my own expenses. But I just felt that a national convention to keep me abreast with my professional field was a necessity. And when Peter Armacost came and they were talking about other people taking turns, each 3 people in the department taking 1 year each in which to go to national convention, I said administrative people and people in administration should go every year. You can't possibly wait every 3 years. 2 great changes are occurring in all of this field. So he agreed to this, and the last years that I was there, I went to conventions with expenses paid every year. All these things had some implication as you came back and tried to implement many of these. So we needed to keep accredited and keep growing. One of the areas that needed more strengthening was the business administration. We also needed to know where we were going to go in current educational trends. The year that Mr. Harbaugh was acting president, we had the Booz Allen Hamilton study. And they made a survey of us to see where we should go and head for in the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And this last year, 1967 and 68, the business department and the business director arranged to have a study made. And so at this point, Mr. Fossey has become the administrative assistant to the president, and there is a new program plan for the financial record keeping and the development of some of these things at the college. But these are all things which were steps in the direction of accreditation. We were again examined by NCATE. We were examined first about 6-7 years ago, and we were given accreditation on NCATE for the high school education that we're training for secondary schools, and then temporary accreditation for elementary education. But if you listen to the taped interview with Martha Matson, you see that we were given full accreditation with NCATE now for elementary education. And it's a real appreciation of the kind of work which she came in, the insight that she had as to what should be taught. Dean Kronbeck had gone to a workshop in higher education and came back with a program which he thought would be the kind of coursework which we needed for setting up the Department of Elementary Education. And she, being interested in this area, I asked her to take a look at it. And she said, well, then Dean Kronbeck had to talk with her, and he said, well, come back with what you would think would be a course. So she sat down on the basis of the needs that teachers would say to me. I have now developed a course in elementary education which I would like to suggest. And this subsequently, although Martin Kronbeck somewhat reluctantly gave up the full plan which he thought was perfect, to bowed out, as it were, to her, and the department was structured as Martha Matson thought it should be, and she has demonstrated in the years since that this has been an exceedingly important and very effective program. We could do well to do something with secondary education along the same line. Of course, a college is composed of students and faculty. I think over the years of some of the people who started some of the strengths in their various departments. R.B. Nell came as the first teacher of science. He was there at Augsburg when I came, a very simple little laboratory down on the ground floor of Old Main, and an exceedingly simple little physics laboratory. But in that physics laboratory, somebody had been experimenting with a radio. And Augsburg at that time had a little radio station in the physics laboratory on the second floor of Old Main. Jenny Skert-Oswald and I were often asked to provide some music for the radio. We were sorry that we didn't have money enough to be able to continue this, but after a while the station went off the air, and subsequently WCAL picked up the air, and you got all the sort of thing that we could do. But Nell stayed for a while and then moved on, but among his students was Arthur Nash, who spent a lifetime in service in science at Augsburg College, and he got his beginning through the work with R.B. Nell. But to have science come into the Augsburg curriculum at this time meant that we were really reaching out into a different aspect of a current curriculum, and beyond the idea that you're just educating men for the ministry, although it might be a good thing for some of the men in the ministry to know something about science. Following Nell, we had, I think, several other people in between, but then came Mr. Fosse, who, during the poverty period at Augsburg, was able to teach science in such a way that he was the teacher of a number of people who've gone into research. Among those who really admired and followed in his footsteps in research and study, Margaret Halbert always paid tribute to Mr. Fosse. The hard work was very, very difficult. And she went into the field of nursing, and then she, for a number of years, was head of neurological nursing at the Bethesda Institutes of Health. And now she is in the Hugh department of the government, and she is a counselor to schools of nursing who want to set up training programs for the education of training nurses for neurological nursing. She has the highest position in the government. She has the highest rank as an armed forces person of any of the women that have ever gone to Augsburg. She's on the Centennial Commission. Then we, during the war period, here we needed to have somebody to come in to be in the field of chemistry. We had brought to America an Estonian refugee by the name of Manevald Aldrich. He was also taking work at the University of Minnesota to learn the English and to learn to do some advanced work, and was going on for a master's degree program at the University of Minnesota and on later toward a doctorate. But we needed a second man in the field. At that time, we asked Mr. George Michelson, who was on the faculty of the university, and asked him who he knew if he could recommend somebody, and he recommended a Mr. Stanley Remeniski. Said the one problem with Mr. Remeniski is that he is Catholic. At this early period at Augsburg, nearly everybody, I suppose Marian Lindeman, as Marian Wilson, was the first big change in the policy of just hiring Lutheran people to teach. This, I have been told, that Mr. Remeniski went to his priest and asked his permission to accept this teaching position at Augsburg College. And his priest said yes, he could do that, providing he didn't take part in any of the religious kind of activities. To which Stan responded that they have a policy that you're expected to go to chapel there. And if I cannot accept the position unless I can do this, well, you may go to chapel, providing you aren't participating. And Stanley Remeniski was always at chapel, and he encouraged his students. He announced in his classes when Spiritual Emphasis Week was coming. And he met students. He said, well, you're going the wrong way. We belong in chapel at this point. And Stanley Remeniski and Manevald Aldrich were the two who had the chance to help plan the present-day chemistry laboratories in Science Hall. And having planned them, they had the opportunity and the heavy responsibility of moving whatever equipment there was over to the Science Hall, setting up all those laboratories, and carrying by hand quantities and quantities and quantities of these things that were required for this new laboratory. In the field of English, there were still many people who were born in Norway, who came to Augsburg, and with the advent of Reverend Peter A. Sveagen came a new day in the field of English. Here was a man, I don't remember the date, was it 1915, 16? I wonder if it wasn't about 1915, because Harold, my brother, spoke about him so often. But here was a man who spoke perfect English. And he could, in his English classes, everybody had to have speeches, public speeches, one day a week. And he would correct these. And I recall after I came to Augsburg in 1923, that on one occasion, Mr. Reverend Olaf Rogney was paying tribute to P.A. Sveagen and saying, "Thank you for all the patience you had with us in pronouncing the S's and the TH's. Well, Leif Sverdrup and Leif Harbo and Bernard Helland and many of these men paid very high tribute to the kind of insight and the opening horizon that there was for the teaching of English, which had changed so remarkably with the advent of Sveagen. Among his students, who have since done tremendous piece of work in our English department, I can mention Ann Peterson, who still is there and has for many years acted as head of the English department, and Gerald Thorsten, who now is at St. Olaf College, but who was head of the department at Augsburg. The impact of this kind of thing and the opening of horizons was very, very enriching to many of these people. In the field of history, there was this man who sat at his desk in that one room and was the registrar. And the registrar consisted of one man, Professor H.N. Hendrickson, who taught history. But he was a perfectly groomed little gentleman. He taught Latin as well. There was never a hair out of place. He had a shoe brush that was in his desk, and when he came into his office, he always looked just perfect. His grooming was this. He loved singing. He loved other kinds of things. He worked with people. But when students came in, he'd sit down and talk with them and ask them where they had been, what courses they'd had, what kind of things they would like. And I can remember once when Omer Johnson came to register, and he said his name was spelled O-M-E-R or O-M-A-R. And Professor Hendrickson said, "You are going to be a college-educated man. You cannot have a name like that. That is a corruption of the name Homer. So I'm going to register you as Homer, H-O-M-E-R, Homer Johnson. That's a perfect name." Well, among the students that he had was one Karl Quislak, who today is head of the history department, and he is doing a splendid piece of work. In the field, and a writer, a creative writer at present engaged in writing the history of Augsburg College. I also had a chance to do some teaching in history, and when I had Karl Quislak as a student in my class, I also had Paul Sonnock and Joel Torstensen and Irving Hole and a number of others who have distinguished themselves as students, regardless of the teaching they had. But Karl Quislak did a term paper on the populist movement. And he has, right now, being published by the Minnesota State Historical Society, a volume which he has written about the populist movement in Minnesota, which sort of had its impetus or the seed planted as far as that class in history was concerned. Joel Torstensen took the paper that he'd written for a term paper for me and enlarged it for his master's degree thesis at the University of Minnesota. It was a subject which had to deal with the Lutheran Church and slavery during the Civil War period. He has been interested in Negro rights and Negro problems all his life, and I think he gained some real deep insight as he did that preliminary work for me and then followed it up later at the university. In the Department of Christianity, of course, when I came to Augsburg, there was, as Dean of Men, Mr. Professor Cy Melby, who was not only the Dean of Men, but he was the head of the Religion Department, and he was the head of the Physical Education Department. A rare combination of a great big he-man who could relate to students and to the men students, who also knew all the little finenesses that he could contribute in many ways. And he said, well, if you really want to know good manners, just buy a book and read it and practice it. I think that I was sort of picayunish and wanted to deal with the little delicate individual things where he could see things in a big scope. I recall one time the state deans of women asked us each to bring our dean of students along. And I was most proud of Mr. Melby because he could handle himself very well with everybody that was there. And I can remember we had a Unitarian pastor who was speaking, and he took issue with some of the things that he said, and they had a little lively discussion during the noon hour. And the deans of women said to me afterwards, "My, aren't you lucky to have a man like that to be your dean?" Then came Dr. Christensen to the faculty, and both in the field of philosophy and in the field of Christianity, who was a scholar and who, in everything that he read and thought and said, seemed to reflect this tremendous scope of scholarship. Into this field of higher education, in the fields of religion, we had Paul Sunnach later and Philip Quanbeck, both of whom who've done some outstanding kind of work in this field. They are the kind of men that students say, we go to these classes, they take us, help us orient our whole field of knowledge and thinking, and they do not make up our minds for us, but they show us how we can make up our own minds and challenge us to do the right kind of thinking. I've had students say that the most valuable class that they've ever had at college was a course either with Sunnach or with Quanbeck. This is a marvelous kind of thing, and it is a way in which one can really do something. Dr. Christensen was always interested in great ideas. He was a student in the seminary when I first came to Augsburg, and I recall that he had selected 12 students at school who were the best intellectual students, and these men had one evening, men-only evening, where they talked about ideas. But he's always been a man who has liked to talk about ideas. And in his early years as a faculty person in evening school work, which he inaugurated, and had some special classes in evening school, in deputation work, wherever it was, tried to get a few people together to talk about ideas. Not about people, not about things, but about ideas and how you can implement ideas. Of course, we had people who were characters like, and you loved them for the warmth of the person that they were. Dr. Ermisch, I suppose, was one of these people who was a teacher of German, who loved the German language. He looked as if he both needed to be dry cleaned and wet washed. And his toupee needed to be dry cleaned also, and brought down to a little gray of his hair, the fringe of which hang down the back. But students who wanted to really talk to somebody, I suppose Dr. Ermisch did more informal counseling with students than practically anybody else at school. And he had all kinds of love for people and warmth. People took his class in German because he was really a delightful person, not that they learned so much German. A characteristic would be, first thing in the morning, he would point to one of the girls and he said, "Have you had breakfast yet? Shame on you. You have to have breakfast before you come to class." Well, one never knew what was going to come. I can remember one chapel talk, too, when he spoke to the chapel students, and he said, "This is a dangerous place. I repeat, this is a dangerous place." Students were listening, because one never knows what kind of challenge God is going to make to you in this dangerous place. But be ready for it. Then we had in the language department Marian Lindeman coming to teach in French. In an earlier record, I've talked about some of our coming. But Marian was not a Lutheran. Marian was not a Scandinavian background. Marian came representing liberal arts. She came to teach French. Did you also teach Spanish to begin with? French. We didn't have Spanish. Spanish was later. Little Latin sometimes to help Hendrickson. But Marian came from the University of Minnesota via France, where she had spent a summer. I shall never forget that entrance that magnificent, beautiful woman made onto our campus and into our lives. And how she could like simple little me, I don't know. But she represented scholarship, refinement, culture, centuries of breeding, all this kind of thing. She brought into our society at Augsburg a quality of life that was more American than we were. We were still very much an immigrant people. And I think many of us reached out for this quality in our life. And this kind of something, when it came to counseling students, she said, give me those who are the non-Lutherans and those who are on the fringe of the community. And truly, many of these people came and sought her out. But in her quiet way, and in especially, I think, a very wonderful way in which she could talk education with Dr. Sverdrup. This led to an influence that was exceedingly meaningful in the development of the college curriculum. She didn't come to many of the social things we did. She didn't do some other things, but she was a part of our academic community that had some very high standards, and herself a capable teacher who demonstrated how she could be a friend. And students who took her class in French not only learned the language, but they learned to love it and some of the culture of that people. Not only of that people, but of the breadth of the world of knowledge that Marian moved around in with such perfect ease. Coming to assist in this foreign language department later came Mimi Kingsley, a beautiful Latin lady. Here we are fortunate at Augsburg at times. Somebody comes to the University of Minnesota and their spouse wants to do something in the field of teaching. And so it was with Mimi Kingsley. Her husband is on the faculty at the University of Minnesota, where they have a regulation that no two members of the same family should be teaching. At least that was the rule then. And we inherited lovely Mimi Kingsley, who speaks 2 languages perfectly without any accent at all. She has done an amazing piece of work in the field of Spanish. And again, she has these high standards of quality that she can somehow impart to her students. And the great expectations, they don't peter out. And Ruth Schmidt, who has earned her doctorate in Spanish, is one of the prized pupils that she has had. In the field of drama, it took a long time before we could have somebody, but after we had decided that drama was a legitimate part of it, we had Lucy May Bergman come, and we did some operettas, and we did some serious drama. And then we had Miss Eileen Cole and Dr. Esther Olson come, and so we have developed in the field of this some of the ideas that are really strong in the field of drama. Dean Quanbeck came in the field of education and helped us establish a much better background in the community and has been a representative on many state committees and on some national committees in developing the educational program for our own state of Minnesota, is highly respected for his contributions here. Later, as he became dean of the college, Dr. Henry Burtness came to be in the education department and did a singular kind of organization and setup of a practice teaching program and all this. It was just excellent, and the fruit of that work is still being felt. Music and athletics are 2 other integral parts of a community. Way back in 1923, we had just barely started to have intercollegiate basketball. And we were admitted into the Minnesota Conference of basketball. And I can recall the excitement that there was when we loaded up all the students in buses and went down to St. Olaf College to play our first intercollegiate basketball game. Every student at school, and I think every faculty person, I think we had 5, 6 chartered buses, and there was one adult person on each one, and lo and behold, didn't we win this game? And one of the cheerleaders for St. Olaf had been in the academy at Augsburg, Reverend Theodor Heimark of the Church of the Good Shepherd. And I can still see the incredible surprise when he discovered that Augsburg, wee little Augsburg, could now win from them. Subsequently, we went into football, and I can remember that we also did some rather startling thing by winning from Gustavus Adolphus when we played football one time. But the development of this program under the leadership of Cy Melby was passed on to Dick Poutz, I suppose it was, who came in. Then he went into the war. And then we had James Peterson, who had a different concept of what the whole field of education for leisure should do. And in this, the importance of the activity of the individual. Instead of so much emphasis upon intercollegiate athletics, he wanted us to think in terms of intramural, getting more people out there actually participating, doing things, learning to do things with their hands, learning other sports. So we added other sports to our program and our curriculum. And then, in the interests of building a sort of a good community spirit, he had talked to Dr. Sverdrup and with me about when the first beautiful spring day comes, let's have a skip day. And dismiss school and go on out, walk along the Mississippi River out to Minnehaha Park. Well, it turned out to be a beautiful spring. And so each day this particular week, Monday we met in Dr. Sverdrup's office. Is this the day? Oh, it's the first day of warmth. No, let's wait and see what it's like tomorrow. So tomorrow came, and it was a little warmer and more nice sunshine, and the grass getting greener and the buds coming out on the trees. No, let's wait one day more. So I think it was on a Wednesday. We decided this was the day that we were going to have our first skip day at Augsburg. And Dr. Sverdrup, at the close of the chapel service, said to the students, "It is a very beautiful day today, that the faculty have decided that it would be very fun to dismiss classes and everybody go out to Minnehaha Park and have a very wonderful day." And the students couldn't believe their ears to what they were hearing. And Dr. Sverdrup had to say, "Well, we really meant it. Are you interested?" And then Jimmy Peterson got up to announce that we were going to form in lines in 15 minutes in front of, right in the center of the campus. And we were going to march out. And he had then made arrangements that we would have food and coffee and donuts out beyond Lake Street Bridge where we would gather. And then we would hike out to Minnehaha. And they would have all kinds of recreation. There, people could bring their baseball bats, and they could bring their badmintons, and they could have softball teams. They could go hiking. They could do this, and we would have a huge picnic supper. This was the first time, and I don't know who the other man was, but I think we have a film on this in the historical library somewhere. And I think Professor Svegen was one of the two first men that led this hike that went out. Svegen. I hiked out those 5 miles many a year with those students and stayed and played all the time till the end of the day. We'd had our supper and picked up and went home. And faculty people could run home and pick up their families and take them along. But it built a tremendous bridge of warmth and friendliness and all. And trying to help people to be creative and learn how to enjoy simple things and the out of doors, and to do things just with each other, just to be happy. So this was the way our skip days started. Well, we added other kinds of sports. We had a very difficult time finding some physical education for women. We had to go over and rented the gymnasium at Monroe School, and the girls went over there for a gym. And we have to get Mrs. Levon Peterson and the people who worked in physical education together in order to have a separate tape recording of all this. But this is a part of some of the things that came. And after Jimmy Peterson left, then we had Mr. Ernie Anderson coming back from the war service. In between, we had the handsome Robert Carlson. as that. And we had Cully Swanson, who worked with us in our department, who later went to St. Olaf College, who's retiring this year, incidentally, from St. Olaf College. Then we had the field of music, and Augsburg people had always been known how to sing. I can recall when I first came to Augsburg, the faculty sat in chairs on the platform in the chapel. There was something like 200-300 students. There were 35 girls. I know from where I sat, I could always count quickly to see 35 if all my protégés were in chapel. But that first day, as I sat down in the chair next to Belle Mehus and Anna Gestal, I sat right below the busts of Professor Georg Sverdrup. And I could remember as a child when I'd lived in Minneapolis, I had gone to commencement with my father and mother, and we sat in the second pew, and Professor Sverdrup came and sat down in front of us before the service was to begin. And he turned to me and he said, "Dette deres datter." "Is this your daughter?" "Yes, this is Gerda." "Jeg håper du vokser opp til å bli en meget snill pike." I hope that you will grow up to be a good little girl, a good person. So somehow, what? This is Georg, the older Sverdrup. And so this was in 1923. That had been in 1906. So here I sort of felt as if the spirit of the man was reaching out to give me a little blessing upon my work as I was starting as a dean of women at this college. But the singing, these students could sing. They loved to sing. And there was, of course, a glee club going. There had been sextets, there had been quartets, there had been gospel duos, there had been all kinds of singing, but singing was integral. Later on in the year, among these 35 women, some came to me and said, "We should really start a girls' glee club." So I went to Mr. Upseth, who had come to be the teacher of music at that time and the director of the male choir, or male glee club, asked, and so all 35 girls came with whatever voice or lack of voice they had to just demonstrate that they had this interest. So we practiced, and Mr. Upseth put us through our paces. And we were getting ready after Christmas to prepare for a little concert tour. And one of the girls came to me and she said, "Miss Mortensen, we've gotten this girls' glee club started now." They called it the choral club. "We've gotten it started, and some of us just simply can't sing, and this is just awful agony for us. But we've done the cause, can't you talk to Mr. Upseth to single out now 20 people, or the group that he thinks could be used for this?" So Jenny Skirtlesville, who taught voice, and I, who is taking some voice lessons from Jenny and who could sing a little, we always traveled with this girls' glee club called the Choral Club. And Mr. Upseth played the cello, so we took his cello along. And the first year we went out on a tour. Well, it happened that the second year I was at Augsburg, I broke an ankle, and I had to walk around in 25 with high shoes and crutches for quite a while. And the following year, I had to have surgery for a gallbladder in January, and we were going to start this tour in March. And Dr. Sverdrup said, "Oh, you have to go with the girls on their first tour. We can't possibly let these girls go out alone without you with them." And it was hard for me to carry even one purse, because in those days they operated from northeast to southwest on the abdomen, and I have 23 stitches. I had been laid wide open. Well, after this, I just said, yes, I'll go with them. But they girls carried my suitcase, they carried my handbag, and they gave me the best place we could. Halfway through the tour, we were in Dalton, Minnesota, at the home of Esther Barley, who was in the choir. She